All right, I want to welcome you to the Making Disciples in Small Groups webinar. And I've got everybody muted now as we go through the presentation, but at the end we'll stop for a minute. We'll take some questions, so you'll have a place to share. The chat window that you used earlier to introduce yourselves, you can also use that to make a comment, to ask a question. Anyway, glad to have you here, and we'll make this as interactive as we can, but we'll do this part first. If you haven't met me, which I know several of you on here have we've met, but anyway, my name is Alan White. I've been a pastor for actually 28 years this year, and my wife and I have been married 18 going on 19 years. We have 4 kids, so our boys are 17, 13, and 5, and our daughter is 11. So we have a very busy house, and 3 of them are here right now. So hopefully we won't be hearing from any of them. I've coached over 1,500 churches in a variety of forms. And since 2011, so the last 7 years, I've helped churches start over 15,000 small groups, which has connected conservatively over 125,000 people into groups, which is really kind of mind-boggling when you think about it, because this wasn't hundreds and hundreds of churches in the last 7 years. This may have been like 200 or 300 churches in the last 7 years. What I do, I work with churches individually, where I meet with pastors, small group pastors and leaders one-on-one. I do coaching groups. I have 2 coaching groups that are starting for 2019. One is for small group ministry, how to, recruit leaders, all of that sort of thing. You can find out more about that on my website. I'm also doing a Disciples Makers coaching group, which I'll be sharing with you at the end of the presentation. That's a new thing for 2019. I've also developed several online courses on leading group launches, coaching group leaders. Currently in the process of signing up people for a live online course on writing effective curriculum, and that information is on the website as well. I've written 2 books, and I also blog over at alanwhite.org. My 2 books last year, I published Exponential Groups with Hendrickson Publishers out of Massachusetts. And this year, I self-published a book called Leading Healthy Groups. And now this Leading Healthy Groups book, what I did was, when I served my last church here in Greenville, South Carolina, I was on staff there from 2007 to 2011. And I would take questions from my leaders. Usually I would survey my leaders. I would find out what their questions were. And then I began to write and train on what their questions actually were, instead of training things that nobody needed, right? And so then I would send it out to all of them. And that became kind of the basis of this book. So when you look at the table of contents, it may not seem like uniform like a small group leader book would be, or some of the questions may seem to be like really specific. But I actually had leaders that asked, how can I meet all of the emotional needs of my members? And of course, the simple answer is you don't. When do I refer somebody to some other group or a counselor or whatever? Or how do I get my group to do their homework? These were actually questions from my leaders. We added some new content to that. And so this one's available on Amazon or on my website either way. But it's just one I'm excited about. It just came out in August. So let's talk about, as you guys had registered for the webinar, you were able to respond and kind of tell me kind of where you're feeling the pain, what's working, what's not working as far as your small groups go. And so these are some of the things that came up. Always a perennial issue is a lack of leaders. Always happens. Low commitment, people, their attendance is spotty. They sign up, they don't show up. I mean, these are all very, very common things. Feelings that groups needed to reach out more, to invite people in, but also to serve the community, to serve their neighbors. Forming groups that last. I tell you what, I've done a lot of church-wide campaigns over the years, and it's fairly easy to get a lot of excitement going for 6 weeks. But then if you don't have the right things in place, the whole thing's going to fall apart, which is not something anybody wants to do. So how do you form groups that actually will last? How do you train your leaders? What do you train your leaders on? I kind of gave you a hint earlier about how I developed that Leading Healthy Groups book. If you want to know what your leaders need to be trained on, you need to ask them. And of course, I'm a big advocate of training through coaching And then how do you get coaches? Well, that's a whole different conversation. That would have to be a whole other webinar there. And then lastly, how do you keep renewed vision, renewed vitality? How do you keep enthusiasm going for groups over the years? And those are kind of things where you guys are sort of feeling it. We're going to address part of these today. Some of these we're going to address, in other webinars. I may send you some articles or something that speak to some of these things more specifically, or we can talk. I do a 30-minute, what I call an assessment. You fill out a little survey ahead of time, and then we set up a time to talk for 30 minutes. I do it completely for free. It's not a sales pitch kind of a thing. But just, to help you. That's what I do. That's what I love doing, is encouraging and helping pastors. So let's talk about our dilemma when it comes to disciple making in groups. And this is going to hit on some of the things you guys talked about. D.L. Moody said this. He said, "The Bible was not given for our information, but for our transformation." And I think when you look at that quote from Moody, this is obviously something that's been around for a while. What does transformation look like? What does transformation look like in the lives of our people and in our groups and in our churches? That's kind of a difficult question, because I'll be honest with you, I don't see a lot of transformation going on. Howard Hendricks put it this way. He said, "Most believers are educated well beyond their level of obedience." They're educated well beyond their level of obedience. If they stop reading the Bible today, which I don't encourage, they would have plenty of things to live out from this point forward, because we understand that just because we know something doesn't mean it makes any difference, doesn't mean that it changes us. It gives us probably more things to feel guilty about, more things to be responsible for. And then I say it this way: we only believe what we actually do. If I believe it's important to be generous and I'm not generous, then I don't believe that statement. If I believe that I should love my neighbor as myself and I don't know my neighbor's name, then I don't believe that I should love my neighbor as myself. You see what I'm getting at? We only believe the things we actually do. If the fire alarm, the smoke alarm, goes on in my house on Sunday morning, so beep, 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 we understand that. What it means is that I have made breakfast for my family, that I have taken the bacon out of the oven, and once I open the oven, the smoke alarm goes off, and my kids come running, not to the front door to go outside to be saved from the fire. No, there is no fire. It's just smoke. They come running to the table, because what they say is this, with that beep, beep, beep: breakfast is ready, breakfast is ready. So my kids know breakfast is ready because the smoke alarm is going off in my house. But most of us, if we were in a building and the alarm went off, we're probably not going to go outside. Why? Because we don't actually believe that the building is on fire. If we believed the building was on fire, we would get the heck out of there, right? All right, let's continue on. Some of the things that we've done in Christian education, things that I was taught, things that, kind of coming up in the church, been in church all my life, the way that I was taught, the way that I learned things, began to reveal some limits in traditional Christian education. My Master of Divinity has a concentration in Christian education. So I am thoroughly educated in what actually doesn't work. So I'm qualified to give this part of the webinar. Our Christian education was adopted from public education, and public education, for the most part, is a product of the industrial age. And the industrial age was started when we, around the turn of the last century, began to manufacture things in an assembly line process instead of a customized process. And so instead of one team or one person building a whole car, then those people would be on an assembly line, and they would do part of the work, and as it went down the line, somebody else would do part of the work. And we have a lot of manufacturing where I live here in Greenville, South Carolina. We make all of the BMW SUVs, all of the X series for the entire world. BMW's largest plant in the world is in South Carolina. We make tires for Michelin. We make, gas turbines for GE. We do all kinds of manufacturing here. And the idea of a manufacturing process is that you start out with raw materials, and those raw materials are made into parts. So we have the BMW plant, but in addition to the BMW plant, we have a lot of suppliers in the area that make the parts that are going to be shipped, in the supply chain to BMW to arrive at the line when it needs to be placed in the car. So raw materials become parts. Parts go to the plant. They're assembled. And then the idea is that we would have a uniformed, finished product, that we have a quality inspection. They make sure that car is going to run. They make sure that it looks nice. They make sure that it's, where it should be and what the customer wants. Because if you're paying that much for a car, it better be perfect, is the thing as it rolls off of the line. That's the assembly line process, which is the basis of public education, which is the basis of Christian education, which we've depended on for years and years to disciple our people. Henry Ford said this. He said, any customer can have a car painted any color he wants, so long as it's black. So not only did you get the same Model T, you got the same color Model T as everybody else. There were no options. You couldn't get satellite radio. You could get any radio. There were no options. You paid money, you got a car. Things are much different these days, aren't they? We can't make disciples on an assembly line. So people do not come to us as raw materials. People do not come to us being exactly the same. People come to us as rich and poor, educated and uneducated, male and female, broken and really broken, addicted and in denial, citizens and immigrants, racially diverse, sexually diverse, religiously diverse, politically diverse, single, married, divorced, widowed, cohabitating, or as we say here in the South, shacking up. People don't come to us exactly the same. So why in the world would we think that developing a process of disciple making would actually turn all of these different kinds of people into disciples? That they would all come out the same way? It doesn't work that way. See, there are no uniformed finished products either. Hopefully, we're going to develop the character of Christ. Hopefully, people are going to follow their calling. But that is not going to look exactly the same for everybody else. Because if you look at a group and they think the same, they talk the same, they dress the same, that just seems like a cult to me, doesn't it? Because the uniqueness and their individuality disappears. God made us to be individuals, gave us personalities. See, no two disciples turn out the same. You look at Jesus's disciples. So you have Peter, who is very impetuous. Some people would say flaky. He was the one that wanted to jump out of the boat. He was the one that when they came to arrest Jesus, he pulled out his sword and cut off Malchus's ear. He's the one that swore he would never deny Jesus, and yet he denied Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed. But he's the one that on the day of Pentecost, when people were saying, what's going on? Peter's the one that jumped up and began to preach the sermon, starting out with, these men are not drunk as you supposed, but this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. And by the end of that talk, the end of that sermon, 3,000 people were saved in a day. Now, that's very different from Paul. Paul, not one of the original 12, but Paul is called to preach the gospel where it's never been preached before. And he didn't spend any length of time at a certain place. You look at Luke, also not one of the original 12, but you look at Luke, and writing his gospel, who set out to write an exact account after he thoroughly researched everything for Theophilus, his student, and to convince him of what he found out about Jesus. Mark had written the gospel already. Matthew had written the gospel already. But then Luke decides, well, I'm going to go back and research all of this for myself, and here you go. So we don't turn out the same. We turn out to be very, very different. We start different. We turn out different. You look at Jesus' disciples. You have Matthew, who is a tax collector, who was in collusion with the Romans, right? Hated by the Jews. And then you have Simon, who's a zealot, who hated tax collectors. And they're both in the same small group. That would be a very interesting small group, wouldn't it? We have different gifts and callings. We're drawn to different things. We have different passions that each one is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. But we're while we function in unity as a church body, we don't function identically. We're called to very different things. There's no sense in becoming jealous of somebody else's calling, because God gave them their calling. God gave you your calling. And that calling may change over time, but it's unique to you. We have different rates of progress in becoming Christ-like. Some people will change dramatically and continue to grow. Some people are very well disciplined and very regimented. Other people, it's one step forward and two steps back. We've seen this, and we become frustrated with the people who aren't like us. So we understand what it's like to be like us, but we don't understand, why is this person so flaky? Why is that person, rushing ahead? All of that. We have different personality types. I kind of hit on that earlier. We have different passions for things. And so when we think about it, look at Starbucks. And this is an old statistic, but at one time they said that at Starbucks you could order your coffee in any one of 89,000 combinations. And now there are far more than that. My daughter was on my phone the other day looking at the menu before we got to Starbucks and discovered that there were 24 different kinds of Frappuccinos. And I didn't even know that there were that many Frappuccinos. She picked out the one that she wanted. She didn't like it. But anyway, we have all of these combinations. We have all of these different ways that we can have things customized to us and personalized for us. And yet sometimes when we get in the church, we have people jump into a single path in order to be developed into a disciple of Jesus Christ. And yet, they're all different. They're not raw materials. This isn't a manufacturing process. One size does not fit all. So, how do you measure spiritual growth? This is a very challenging question. The easiest metrics are to measure things like, how many lessons have they completed? How many verses have they memorized? How many meetings have they attended with their small group? See, most of these are knowledge-based objectives because these are very easy things to quantify and very easy things to measure. But what about, how do you measure life change? How do you measure changes in people's attitudes? How do you measure changes in people's behavior? That's more difficult to measure, and I think that's why we focus on measuring these sorts of knowledge-based objectives. Now, don't get me wrong. God gave us a book, and God gave us a brain, and this is not a coincidence. There is something to be said for this. There's something to be said with being in God's Word and allowing God's Word to speak to us and applying it to our lives. There is something to be said for that. And so I'm not, I'm old school. I think that small groups should have a Bible study. I don't think it should just be kind of whatever you want to talk about and have this pooling of ignorance. So don't get me wrong in this. But the question is, how do we go about this? That once we learn these things from God's Word, what do we do with it? So are we making disciples? That's the big question. We have church-wide campaigns. We have studies. We have personal devotions. We, do all kinds of things. But are we truly making disciples? And so we have to ask ourselves, when we look at the people in our church, what are their attitudes? And sometimes their attitudes are not so good. See, some people are kingdom-minded. Some people are growing, but some people are mean and they're racist and they're abusive and they're unethical. They know, but it hasn't changed their outlook. What are their behaviors? Well, some people are putting others first and loving their neighbors. Some people are distracted or self-absorbed or judgmental. So how do we get our attitudes and our behaviors to reflect the one that we're disciples of, and that's Jesus Christ? That we thought, if we have this knowledge, then we're going to act on this knowledge. But it doesn't work that way. The Bible tells us that knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Just imagine if you could preach a sermon on a topic and it would radically change everyone in your congregation, related to their attitudes and related to their actions. How amazing would that be? But that's not how it works. People have to work it into their lives. They have to change their habits. They have to change their patterns of thinking and behavior. And we've got a lot to compete against because people are very, very distracted. And I would even say most people only think about church when they're at church. So how do we make disciples out of all these people that are busy and distracted? You see, the way we've been doing this, I mean, I went through Sunday school all of those years. And, as a kid, you need to learn the stories. You need to have that foundation. But we continue to train people by giving them more and more, information. And it's if there's, like, we get to heaven, there's some kind of final jeopardy. And we pass final jeopardy in heaven and everybody celebrates that. Well, here's the thing. There is no final jeopardy in heaven. So what exactly are we doing? Our hope is that people would learn the Bible and they would have half a clue and they would begin to do it. Some people do. Some people don't. So how do you measure spiritual growth? Marcus Buckingham, who wrote the Strength Finder series, he said this. He said, the problem with people is they're just never done. I'm not done. You're not done, right? People are just never done. So how do you measure spiritual growth? Well, maybe it's seeing how people want to grow and helping them achieve their personal goals, how they want to grow in their character, how they want to grow in their relationships, how they want to grow in their understanding and use of finances, how they want to grow in their understanding use of their gifts and serving the community. So what are they passionate about? What's front and center in their life that they need to change? Hopefully measure how fulfilling Christ's mission. How well are we going and making disciples of all nations? How well is that happening? How well are we reaching and bringing other people in? And not just, converting them, but actually tracking with them and helping them to grow, helping them come into a new way of life. Part of growth is maybe receiving the input of other people and having some sort of accountability, not accountability that's placed on us. That doesn't work. But accountability that we ask for to say, I need to accomplish this. I need to set a goal for myself. And when we set a goal, it needs to be clear, it needs to be reasonable, and it needs to be accountable. So I set a goal for myself, and my goal lately has been losing weight. So we'll just use that one. So I need to lose weight because if not, the doctor is going to give me medicine because there's some things that are out of whack. But if I do diet and exercise, so I set a goal. And how much do I want to lose? Well, the last 6 months I've lost 20. The next 6 months I'd like to lose 20 more. So that's my goal. And then I ask somebody, would you check in with me? Would you help me track my progress? Would you encourage me in this? But let's look at it a different way. I was single until I was 35 years old, which means that for the first 10 years as a pastor on staff at a church, I was single. Oh my goodness, that's ridiculous because all the little old ladies want to set you up with somebody, right? I survived it. But, when I was a Christian, I lived by myself. I didn't have a pet. I didn't have a roommate. I had nothing. I lived by myself. And as a single Christian living by himself, I tell you what, I was a pretty amazing Christian. I was a pretty amazing Christ follower. I really couldn't see that there were any big problems. And then I got married and things changed a lot. I realized once I got married that I was really selfish. And I thought, well, look at that. I got married and then suddenly I become selfish. Well, marriage didn't make me selfish. Marriage revealed how selfish I was. And so it's like I have this person in my life and it's like she's carrying around this mirror and which forces me to see angles of myself that I had never saw before, or I just kind of ignored it, and realizing that there were things in my life that didn't measure up, that marriage revealed in that. And my friend Gary Thomas wrote a book called Sacred Marriage, and his premise is But what if marriage was intended to make you holy rather than happy? But there are a lot of opportunities for, our relationships, our mentors, people that we invest ourselves in, people that we work with, people that just giving people permission. Brian Phipps says it this way: to give us pure feedback. People that love us, that aren't impressed with us. We don't have to put on for them, but they can tell us the truth. I think we need that sort of thing in order to grow. Loving actions out of our love for Christ. So I'm grateful for Christ. It's interesting, Daniel M. at Lifeway wrote a book called No Silver Bullet. And in that, he found in the research at Lifeway that people who regularly confessed their sins to God were more prone to sharing the gospel with other people. Isn't that an interesting statistic? So having an understanding that I am not perfect, that when I sin, when I fall short, I can bring that to Christ and Christ will forgive me. And out of the gratitude, the amazement, the work of Christ in our life, that those people are more prone to share the gospel with other people. Whereas people that didn't regularly confess their sin were not as prone to share the gospel. Now, that doesn't mean that if they're not sharing the gospel that they're just hiding a bunch of sin. It could be, but don't take that too far. But I found that was fascinating. And again, not anecdotal, but just from research. Putting other people first. How well do we put other people first? Making progress. So if I look back a year from now, how is my life different now than it was a year ago? And then how do I want my life to be different a year from now than how it is today? Because we have a whole year to work on it. There's a saying that goes that we overestimate what we could accomplish in a day and we underestimate what we could accomplish in a year. So we can, we get kind of ahead of steam and then we make great plans and then we don't do any of it because we don't have accountability. We haven't actually stated our goal or said it out loud to anybody or asked anybody for help or support in all of that. But how are we making progress? Because people can sit back and say, well, I've been a Christian for 47 years, which I actually have. And I've been a Christian for 47 years. Well, is it 47 years of progress? Or am I reliving the same year over and over 47 times? And I'm not going to say that I've done the same year 47 times, but I'm also not going to say that I've made 47 years of progress. So how do we set goals for ourselves? Not to turn this into a works kind of a thing, but to say, okay, God, show me for the next 12 months, what's the thing that I need to work on? What needs to change in my attitude? What needs to change in my heart? What needs to change in the way that I conduct myself? And allow God to speak to us through his word. But we spend the time with the word not just to understand it, but to actually motivate us to do something about it. Think about our reward in heaven. Is that going to carry us through? All right, so let's talk about disciple making in small groups. Jesus had a group of 12. We know that. But here's the interesting thing. When you look at the gospel, 75% of Jesus's interactions were with his disciples, and only 25% were with the crowd. 75% with the disciples, 25% with the crowd. What do we do? I mean, how many times have you heard, well, the biggest thing we do all week is the weekend service? Well, why is that the biggest thing? Well, because numerically, that's when the most people are there. So because it's the biggest thing that we do all week, you look at the money we spend on buildings, you look at the staff time and energy that's applied to that, you look at the resources that are poured into a weekend service so we can have people for an hour, a lot of people for an hour, and teach them and worship. And there's value in all of that. But are we making disciples? I served a church here in Greenville. It was a church of 6,500 adults. We had a $6.5 million budget. and only 10% of the budget went to actually doing the work of the ministry. Everything else paid staff salaries, paid for the building, paid for equipment, all of these sorts of things. And did we reach a lot of people? We reached a lot of people. But were we making disciples? I mean, what if we did ministry the way Jesus did ministry and spent 75% of our time, energy, effort, finances on growing disciples and 25% on the weekend? And here's a little hint. You know, I loved seeker services. Coming out of a traditional environment and going into seeker services, contemporary music, relevant messages, I loved all of it. I'm right on the tail end of the baby boomers. But here's the deal. The next 25 years is not the last 25 years. That what worked for us in the last 25 years in reaching boomers is not going to work in the next 25 years reaching millennials and Generation Z. So here's an alarming statistic. I should have a slide on here, but I don't. And that is this, that among baby boomers, 65% were Christians. Among millennials, 15% identify themselves as Christians, and 4% of Gen Z identify themselves as Christians. You know, we've heard it said for a long time that we're only one generation away from the extinction of Christianity. And when I look at those statistics going from 65% of boomers, 15% of millennials, 4% of Generation Z, it makes me pause and ask, could this be the generation where this coming generation, could this be the generation when Christianity becomes extinct in North America? I mean, after we're all gone and the numbers keep slipping. I know I seem like kind of morbid right now, but it's like, are we fulfilling the mission? Are we making disciples? How do we accomplish this? See, groups can and should make disciples because we have that smaller environment where people can get to know each other, and it's not cookie cutter and it's more custom, and we get to know each other, and the things that we talked about before of having people that love us but aren't impressed with us. All of those things are possible, but the thing that we have to make sure is are the groups doing a study from semester to semester? I think the thing that we have to get to is, are the groups are they intentionally making disciples? Are they intentionally working toward reflecting the character and the calling of Christ? Because if we're not doing that, we're not making disciples. And, I kind of feel like I have small group fans here, so I don't think I'm going to step on anybody's toes with this. But small groups in a lot of churches are used for the purpose of retaining the weekend attendance. Because people will get lost in a crowd. So how do we keep them around? We get them connected into a small group. And small groups in a lot of places serve only an assimilation purpose. And it's almost like the discipleship part of small groups has been completely forgotten. And I think that's a huge mistake. So rather than looking at this as, our metric is how many people attended and how much money did they give, or some people say butts and bucks, right? Because you have to have that going in order to keep this big service going, in order to maintain this building, in order to have all of this staff. And I'm not saying that it's unnecessary. I think some of the expenditure, some of the things that we do with it are possibly unnecessary because we're trying to compete with the world. And there's a saying around these days that goes this way. It says, you can't out Netflix. And besides that, all of the bells and whistles and the lights and, the high production and all of that, that was for boomers and Gen X. Now you listen to people like Kara Powell talk about millennials, and she says things like, well, warm is the new cool. To have something that's more authentic, to have something that's more genuine, something that's more approachable. And that's where I see the opportunity of making disciples in small groups. That this would be more attractive to those groups, of being serious about what if Jesus meant what he actually said. I read an article in Entrepreneur Magazine a while back, and it said that millennials are seeking a purpose-driven mission. Entrepreneur Magazine is not a Christian magazine. And I thought that was an interesting statement. But we have a generation that's willing to be challenged. We have a generation that's willing to invest themselves in something of significance. I think that the cause that we're living for is something of significance. I think the methodology is completely different. And I think small groups is an ideal place where we can make disciples. We just have to make sure that we're not doing an assembly line, knowledge-based approach to disciple making in a group when it could really be multifaceted. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm getting all fired up. Some milestones in small groups. Well, Jesus started his group by saying, come and follow. Come and follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men. So we see here there is kind of this assimilation of getting people together, getting people connected. We can see here this idea of a church-wide campaign. And I'm not against campaigns. I've been doing campaigns or promoting, coaching churches on how to do campaigns for 14 years. My first book is all about doing campaigns. But I think there's this come and follow, come and try it out, kick the tires, see if this is something you want to be a part of. But there's a progression in this, because if we keep at the come and follow level, we're going to begin to have a diminishing return, because eventually people are going to get sick of this because we aren't challenging them enough. So Jesus went from come and follow to come and die, that unless you take up your cross daily and follow me, you are not my disciple, and ask for commitment. So there's a place for come and follow, but there's an intentionality of come and die, and then there's a go and make disciples. And so we have these milestones where our groups need to be making progress. Our people need to be making progress. Instead of, we just need to provide everything for our people. We don't. We need to provide direction for them. We need to provide opportunity for them. And then we need to allow God to do his thing. Early on in ministry, God gave me kind of a picture of groups. And so this is interesting. I have to make an admission before this is going to make sense to you. And the admission is that, my name is Alan. I'm a recovering control freak. And so, for me, my idea of small groups was that they would all study the same thing. They would all do the same thing, that they will all kind of just line up and march. And that was kind of my idea of how groups should be. And so God gave me this picture of tending small groups, kind of like being a gardener in a nursery, like you see on the screen. And so when you look at a nursery, you have all of these different varieties of plants, and they have some things in common. They need sunlight, they need water, and they need food. And they all need those things, but they don't need those things in the same amounts. Some plants do better in the sun. Some plants do better in the shade. Some plants need more water. Some plants hardly need any water. And then they need different kinds of minerals and nutrients in order to thrive. And there are all of these many varieties of plants. And so when you look at your groups, some of them, maybe annual flowers, some of them may be perennials. Some may be oak trees, some may be cactus. I think you know which ones are cactus. But they're a little thorny, right? But this was the idea of how do we customize an intentional discipleship experience. And so much of this, it's not dependent on programming, which is kind of more assembly line. It's not so much dependent on here's a progression of curriculum, because that's also kind of assembly line. But it's this idea of cultivating a disciple-making environment or disciple-making atmosphere where we're there to learn. We're there to grow. We're there to build each other up. We're there to be sent out. And I think it takes on a little bit of a different nature, that when we learn something, we only learn something with the intent of actually doing it. Instead of we learn something to understand one more thing so that we can qualify for the Bible Jeopardy in heaven. That's not the case. So how do we fulfill our mission? Well, some people would say, well, our discipleship process is connect, grow, serve. And that's out there. You go into Google Images, type in connect, grow, serve, and good Lord, look at all the logos that pop up. I think this is an assimilation process. I don't think this is a discipleship process. See, disciples aren't made on an assembly line or in a process. Disciples are crafted. So when we look at crafting disciples, we think about something that's customized, something that's personal, something that's unique, because again, they don't all start at the same place. They don't all end at the same place. And the journey from start to finish, if you will, does not follow the same straight line. And if you serve in a larger church, the first thought that comes to mind is, there's no possible way. How can I have this customized thing for every person in my congregation? And so what happens to us is that when we get above a certain size, I've served two churches. One was a church of 1,500. One was a church of 6,500. But if you have more than 150 people, you're probably already defaulting toward a process because of the sheer volume of people that need to be disciples. We think of some programmatic way of responding to them. And yet, it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, even if you just do the math of if you were to spend the next 12 months with 8 people, and you say, well, Jesus had 12. Well, as Mike Breen says, choose 6 or 8 because you're not Jesus. But you had 8 people. And at the end of a year, those 8 people intentionally got their own group of 8 people. And then the next year, those 64 got their own group of 8 people. Within about 4 or 5 years, and this isn't ever going to be perfect math because some people are not going to make it this far. But within 4 or 5 years, you're talking about 4,000 or 5,000 people that are involved in something like this that started with 8. We're just on this call with Brian Phipps, who has a ministry called Disciples Made in the Kansas City area. And he was talking about just the parable about a little bit of yeast leavens the whole loaf. So you start with this small thing. You don't wreck everything that you have. You don't start, I found something new and better. Alan White said, don't ever do that. Because what you're doing is working for some people. But as you're going to begin to introduce something new, start it small. And find 8 people that can catch the vision for this, that we're going to be serious about what we're reading and what we're learning. We're going to do something about it, and we're going to develop ourselves to the point where we're going to be able to disciple other people. And go and make disciples, teaching them to obey all that I've commanded you. I know I skipped the baptism part, but that's in there too. But this is our purpose. This is what we're supposed to be doing. And anything else that we're doing that doesn't line up with making disciples and teaching people to obey, I kind of put it in the category of playing patty cake. So we don't have time for that. Creating a culture of multiplication. So we live in a very self-absorbed culture in North America. People's chief interest is self-interest. But you think is as people are beginning to grow in the character qualities of Christ, as spending time with Jesus and spending time with people that are growing themselves, they begin to rub off on each other. Then we begin to realize this is not just about us. This is about leading other people in the same experience so that they can have more of God, so that their lives will be more fulfilled. This is a complete rabbit trail, so I'll just spend a minute there. But you look at things that are coming from Eastern religion that are filling a need that Christianity is not filling for people. And some of it we don't even look as Eastern religious practices anymore. So I'm just going to say it. You can get mad at me if you want to. You know my email address. Mindfulness is Buddhist. Transcendental meditation is Hindu. Yoga is Hindu. And yoga is just exercise. Yoga is spiritual. And I know I may sound like, some yahoo from way back when that let his hair go gray, but you look at the places where Eastern religion is creeping in and meeting a need, and even in the church, because people don't fully understand what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. They don't understand that Jesus has everything to meet 100% of their needs, because we felt sorry for people, or we've accommodated them, or they've become consumers, or whatever, and we're not getting them to that place where they're actually growing. Personal disciplines, spending time in the Word, spending time in prayer. And and the problem is that people are like, well, I'm busy. I can't get up an hour earlier in the morning. Well, just because it's an hour earlier in the morning doesn't make it more spiritual, right? So I used to challenge people to have a 7-minute quiet time. So 7 minutes, the first 2 minutes you spend in silence. And the silence is, I don't have to do anything for God. I don't have to think anything for God. All I need to do is to be here and be still and be with God. And when you start this, you have to have a timer, because you're going to think 2 minutes have passed, like 10 seconds have passed, right? So 2 minutes of silence, 3 minutes of reading the Bible, a minute to think about what is God saying to me? A minute to think about what does God want me to do about this? And then a minute in prayer. I think that's 7 minutes. If it's not, then you can play with the numbers. People say a 7-minute quiet time. What kind of a quiet time is a 7-minute quiet time? I said, well, it's 7 minutes longer than what you're doing right now. And they go, oh, yeah. Now, how do we motivate our people to do that? Well, we have a great ability to communicate with people, and it's something that they carry around with them all the time. All the time. And so they carry this around with them. See, I've got messages on mine right now, but we're not going to read those messages. So on this device, I can send to people. I know that they're working on something. I know that they're setting a goal. They've asked me for a little bit of accountability. They can have a partner within the group that texts them and says, how's it going? Or I'm praying for you today. We could send out a verse to them every day. I get a devotional every morning on my text message, and it's a thought and a verse for the day. And by pushing it out to people, you cause them to think about it. So we can implement personal disciplines, not in, I'm going to go spend half an hour up on a mountain, which is a great thing to do, but most people don't have that, or half a day. Goal setting and accountability, we talked about. Experiences. Now, here's the interesting thing. When you think about a time in your life when you've grown the most significantly in your spiritual growth, it usually revolves around, for a lot of people, a time when they were maybe in college and they were part of a Christian organization on campus and they rubbed shoulders with Christians on a regular basis. That would be one. The other is when you encounter an extreme amount of pain. Pain is a tremendous motivator. However, it's very unpopular to convince people that you need to experience some kind of pain to grow spiritually. That's a very hard sell. But I think equal to that is the idea of taking a risk. And so if I take a risk could be a missions trip. A risk could be going next door and meeting my next door neighbor for the first time, even though I've lived next to him for 10 years. Now, I know my neighbors. But that could be a risk for somebody, and praying for that neighbor and serving that neighbor. I'm talking about practical things. What's a risk? A risk for some people would be letting their coworkers know that they're a Christian. That would be a risk. But some way in serving, some way in outreach, some kind of a risk that goes along with this, because there's a place for learning, but there's certainly a place for doing and living this out and practicing these things. Multiplying our lives. Who do we invest in? Invest in our children, invest in our neighbors, invest in our friends, invest in our small group, invest in someone that we're mentoring. So here's what I see with the current status of discipleship is the behaviors and attitudes of many church members are similar to people who are far from God. And studies have been done that people in church and people outside of the church are acting and thinking almost in identical ways. That knowledge-based approaches to discipleship don't change the attitudes and actions of most believers. And that people are whole beings. So therefore, discipleship must apply to every aspect of their being. Spiritual, emotional, physical, financial, relational, vocational, mental, personal, and missional. So it's not just learning about things, but how are we living this out? I was on a webinar the other day with Pete Scazzaro, that emotionally healthy spirituality. He said this, he said, Jesus may be in your heart, but grandpa's in your bones. So there are some things to work out, but these are also things that can inform us of how well we're doing. I mean, you look at our physical being, the Bible doesn't speak that much to our physical being. We read that physical exercise profiteth little, to use the King James. We learn that this lowly body will be exchanged for a heavenly body, which we're looking forward to that. But there's something about physical discipline that also makes us begin to think about discipline in other areas of our life. And I'm not talking about a rigid thing, but I am talking about a regular thing. We look at our finances, and I could camp here for a while. I could camp on all of these for a while. But we had a missionary from Liberia that came to our church, and his name is Dennis Agri. And he's a native Liberian. He's an evangelist. He's a remarkable man. And our missions pastor asked Dennis, he said, what would you say are idols in America? And Dennis said, in America, your idols are credit cards. Because you use a credit card before you go to God and ask for him to provide. That it provides security. I don't want to get too far on that. I hate credit cards. Anyway, so all of these sorts of things, because we are a whole being. And so we can disciple our mind, but all of these other areas could be out of whack. And then you have to say, well, how much do we actually learn? Because we only believe the things that we do, right? All right. Effective approaches to disciple making are multifaceted and multidisciplinary. So there's a place to learn something. There's a place to discuss something. There's a place to do something. There's a place to evaluate what we've done. There's a place, obviously, to hear from God. There's a place to take a risk. But it has to involve a lot of different sorts of things instead of, well, we're going to get together, we're going to study, and then we're going to say, that's a really good study, can't wait till next week. You know, our curriculum should be as much life as it is a study guide, you know. Effective approaches to disciple making must fit within the schedules of overly busy people without becoming an add-on to their lives. Now, this is tricky because people are going to have to give some things up in order to become the disciple that they're called to be. I mean, our lives are so busy and preoccupied. How is this ever possible? So we have to think of ways that we can push the word out to them and influence their thinking. I mean, most Christians, let's face it, are discipled by television. I mean, I'm not talking about Christian television. I'm talking about all types of television. And you look at some of the actions and some of the attitudes in our world today, and they reflect things that come from television. They don't reflect things that come from the Bible. You look at things that people are accepting of today that the Bible is against. You know, when I was a kid, I used to read these verses that talked about the gospel being offensive. And I thought, who in the world, the gospel, you know, the Bible's wonderful. Who would ever be offended by the gospel? You look at our culture now, talk about offended. Holy cow. All right. Many pastors and staff members have not been effectively discipled themselves and find it difficult to disciple others? I know I'm leaving you with more questions and answers here, but there are some issues here. So I've decided in this next year, I'm going to do a coaching group, and I'm only taking 5 churches, and I've one spot spoken for, so 4 more. But what we're going to do in the group is 4 parts. One part is we're going to have a conversation with some experts in the area of disciple making, kind of in this multifaceted, multidisciplinary approach. So people like on your screen here, Warren Bird, and talk about his book with Dave Ferguson called Hero Making, Pete Scazzaro, Mike Breen of the Missional Idea is actually the first speaker on January the 10th. Dee Eastman is here she's the director of the Daniel Plan out at Saddleback Church, but also looking at, Gary Thomas and Sacred Marriage, and Bruce Bugby talking about spiritual gifts, and a wide variety of people talking about all of these different areas and how it influences our growth. So we have a better understanding, not, for ourselves and what we need to grow, but also for people in our church. So a monthly conversation with experts. There would be also a monthly conversation with the group to talk about methods of disciple making. There would be a monthly one-on-one conversation with me and you to talk about where you've been with disciple making in your church, where you're headed with disciple making, how to customize some of these things to your particular church. And then the last would be just some short reading assignments, maybe an article here and there. My idea is that you would take 12 months, you would devote an hour a week to this. So 3 of those hours would be meetings, either the group meetings or the one-on-one. And then 1 hour, give or take, would be some sort of a reading assignment, maybe to prepare ourselves for the next speaker. Investment for 12 months. There are 4 options as far as the cost goes. And this is a little more expensive than some of the things that I do because I am inviting speakers in and there's some honoraria involved and that sort of thing. So 4 options. One is would be $300 a month for 10 months. The second would be $575 a month for 5 months. The third would be $2,500 upfront. And then the fourth option is I'm going to put together a waiting list. And so if you look at this money and you think there is no way in the world I'm going to get this kind of money out of my budget, then you can go ahead and sign up. You can sign up online on the webpage. I'm going to give you the webpage in a minute. And you can sign up to be on the waiting list. And there's a box there that you put in the amount that you can afford to be a part of a group like this. Now, obviously, if the group fills up and everybody pays, in one of the first 3 options, then the group is closed. But if I have 4 people in the group and there's a spot open, then, even if you can't afford the whole amount, I would want to include somebody instead of having that spot, remain empty. It's a little different than other things that I've done. I don't know if this will work or not. We'll see. So if you're interested in this, you can go to allenwhite.org/disciple. And you can find out more information about what we're going to be doing in the next year, a better idea of some of the speakers, some of the topics that we'll be covering. And then there's a proposal there that you can download and look at that kind of give you all of the details of this. And then there's also a button that you can click. You say, hey, I want to register for this thing. And you select a payment option or you select to be on the waiting list. And then we'll have a conversation from there. So that's what I have. It's 4:02. I went longer than I did yesterday. I think I talked faster yesterday or something. But anyway, I'm going to open this up just for questions that you might have.